Imagine discovering that the horse-drawn buggy belonging to two missing sisters had been buried deep inside an abandoned mine shaft for 9 years. But here's the truly terrifying part. The sisters themselves were nowhere to be found. If you think you know how this story ends, I promise you don't. Hit that subscribe button right now, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me, would you have the courage to search for answers if everyone told you to stop looking? It was the summer of 1995 when everything changed for the Vault family. Keela Vault was standing in her barn, the familiar scent of leather and oil filling the air as she worked on the harnesses. This was a task her daughters had always loved doing together. Eva was 19, Elizabeth was 23, and they were inseparable. That morning, like so many mornings before, they'd hitched their horse to the family's delivery wagon and headed out to make their rounds through the settlement and neighboring farms. But they never came home. For 9 years, the accepted story in their tight-knit Amish community was simple. The girls had run away. People whispered that they'd been seduced by the modern world, that the temptation of English life had been too strong to resist. After all, there was no evidence of foul play, no witnesses, nothing to suggest anything sinister had happened. The wagon was gone. The girls were gone. And that was that. Keela never believed it, not for a single day. She knew her daughters. She knew their faith, their commitment to the community, their love for their family. They would never have left without a word, but without evidence, without proof, what could she do? The whispers continued, and the years stretched on, and the pain of not knowing ate away at her soul. Then, in 2004, everything changed. State environmental workers were conducting mandatory inspections of abandoned mine shafts in the remote foothills near the settlement. There'd been a scandal involving chemical contamination in another part of the state, and now every old mining site was being surveyed. Deep in a narrow shaft they designated as Site 44B, the crew discovered something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't mining equipment. It was a horse-drawn buggy wedged tight far below the surface. The discovery shattered the runaway theory instantly. This wasn't evidence of an escape. This was proof of violence, of disposal, of something unspeakably dark. But if the buggy was in the mine shaft, where were Eva and Elizabeth? When Detective Vance Russo pulled up to the Vault farm that day, Keela knew immediately that something had shifted. You don't send a major crimes detective to deliver good news. He told her about the buggy, about the mine shaft, about the ongoing extraction, and Keela did something that would set her on a collision course with her own community. She demanded to see it. The elders would disapprove. Russo warned her. The site was dangerous. The extraction still in progress. But Keela was unwavering. If it was her daughter's buggy, she would know it. She had to see it with her own eyes. The drive into the foothills was long and jarring. They traveled deeper and deeper into mining territory, a desolate landscape of scrub oak and forgotten history. When they finally arrived at the site, Keela saw the machinery, the organized chaos of the recovery operation, and then she saw the shaft itself. It was wider than she'd imagined, about 15 feet across, descending into absolute darkness. And then the buggy began to rise, suspended by thick ropes, caked in layers of dried mud and grime. It looked less like a vehicle, and more like the skeletal remains of something dredged from the depths of the earth. The wooden wheels were damaged, spokes broken or missing entirely. The black vinyl seat was torn and shredded. It hung there, rotating slowly, and Keela felt every fragile hope she'd constructed over 9 years collapse in an instant. But she needed certainty. Amish buggies all looked similar to outsiders, but each one bore the unique marks of its owner. Small repairs, modifications made over years of use. Keela knew what to look for. She knelt down in the dirt, ignoring the forensic team's protests, and examined the undercarriage, specifically the rear axle brace. And there it was, a rough, uneven weld where her husband Ephraim had repaired a fracture the summer before the girls disappeared. He'd borrowed an English welding torch, done the work himself, been proud of the repair, even though it was ugly. It was a detail so specific, so intimate, that it couldn't be mistaken. This was their buggy. The confirmation brought no relief, only crushing weight. But here's where the mystery deepened in the most disturbing way possible. When the specialized team had searched the mine shaft before extracting the buggy, they'd found nothing else. No human remains, no clothing, no personal items. Just the wagon, thrown into the earth like refuse. The agonizing question remained. If the buggy was here, where were Ivor and Elizabeth? For 9 years, that buggy had been their tombstone, but now it was evidence. Evidence of what, exactly, no one could say. The forensic analysis yielded almost nothing. 9 years of mud and decay had erased most traces. The investigation stalled almost immediately, and Quila was left with more questions than answers. The community's reaction was complicated. Some people offered quiet support, bringing food and condolences. Others kept their distance, their disapproval evident. The elders came to Quila's home and urged her to step back, to accept the mystery, to find solace in prayer. They warned that further involvement with the English authorities would only bring more sorrow, that it would distance her from her faith and her people. But Quila couldn't let it go. She wouldn't. And then, just when it seemed like the trail had gone completely cold, everything exploded again. A young woman named Zilla Hostetler was walking home from a quilting circle one evening. She was 19, the same age Ivor had been when she vanished. The path she took was familiar, winding through dense cornfields, but that night, a dark utility vehicle pulled up beside her, and a man jumped out. He was large, heavy-set, his face obscured by shadows and the glare of the headlights. He grabbed Zilla's arm with brutal force and tried to drag her into the vehicle. And here's what's so chilling. He didn't just attack her. He spoke to her. He said, "You think you're so pure? You're nothing but hypocrites." The hatred in his voice was visceral, personal. But Zilla fought back with unexpected ferocity. She bit down hard on his hand, tasting blood, and when he loosened his grip, she scrambled backward and ran into the cornfields. The man pursued her briefly, crashing through the stalks, but eventually gave up and sped away. Zilla emerged from the field traumatized, her clothes torn, her arms covered in scratches. The attack shattered any remaining illusion of safety in the settlement. This wasn't a random act of violence. The discovery of the buggy and this new assault were connected. The threat wasn't buried in the past. It was active, immediate, and targeted at Amish women specifically. Now, Zilla was too traumatized to speak directly to Detective Russo. She only trusted Quila, bonded by their shared experience of trauma. So Quila became the bridge, gently coaxing details from Zilla and translating them for the investigation. And 2 details stood out as absolutely critical. First, the smell. Zilla described a strong, pungent odor clinging to her attacker. Sour, yeasty, like the mash left over from brewing. It was distinctive, unusual, especially in a community where alcohol consumption was strictly regulated. Second, his words. The phrases he'd used were laced with bitterness and resentment. He'd called Zilla a fraud, said the Amish thought they were better than everyone else. This wasn't random violence. This was someone with intimate knowledge of Amish culture and a deep-seated hatred for it. Detective Russo increased patrols, but the settlement's isolation made constant surveillance impossible. And that night, when Quila returned to her own farm, she found something that made her blood run cold. Nailed aggressively to her front gatepost was an envelope. Inside, a message written in crude, erratic handwriting. "Stop searching. They are dead anyway. Leave the past buried or more will follow." It was a direct threat, a confirmation that the attack on Zilla was connected to the discovery of the buggy. The perpetrator knew who Quila was. He was watching her, reacting to her involvement. And suddenly, a chilling certainty settled over her. The man who attacked Zilla was the same man who took her daughters. The letter was analyzed for fingerprints and DNA, but nothing useful was found. The perpetrator had been careful. He'd been hiding his tracks for 9 years, and he knew how to stay visible. But Quila realized something crucial. If the police investigation was moving too slowly, constrained by procedures and lack of evidence, then she would have to find answers herself. She started by retracing the exact delivery route Ivor and Elizabeth had taken that day in July 1995. It was a route she hadn't traveled in its entirety since the disappearance. The memory was too painful, but now it was necessary. Early one morning, before the sun had fully risen, she hitched her horse to her own buggy and set out, leaving only a vague note about visiting relatives. The route was extensive, winding through the settlement and extending to neighboring English farms. Quila stopped at each location, visualizing her daughters on the road ahead of her. She spoke to people who had seen the girls that day, asking if there was anything unusual, any unfamiliar vehicles, any strangers in the area. Most people had nothing new to offer. The girls had seemed happy, cheerful, completely normal. The trail went cold after the general store in the small town of Oak Haven. From there, Ivor and Elizabeth would have started their return journey, taking the back road that skirted the edge of the foothills. This isolated stretch was where the abduction likely occurred, and that's when Quila found it. A break in the dense foliage on the side of the road, subtle and easily missed. Behind the screen of brush was a barely visible track, an old service road, probably used for logging or mining access decades ago. It was overgrown and rutted, but still passable for a vehicle with high clearance, and it led directly into the foothills, toward the mining territory. This was the abduction point. It offered isolation, a place where someone could lie in wait, hidden from the main road. And it provided a direct route to transport victims and evidence away from populated areas without being seen. The perpetrator was organized, calculated. He knew the terrain intimately, which meant he was likely local. The clues were starting to align: the smell of yeast, the anti-Amish sentiment, the knowledge of local geography. Quila realized she needed to look closer at outsiders who interacted with the community, people who lived on the fringes, both geographically and culturally. Her investigation led her to Oak Haven, the nearest non-Amish town. Navigating the modern world was deeply uncomfortable for Quila. The noise, the chaos, the curious stares her Amish attire drew. But she pushed forward, stopping first at the general store, then at the feed market on the edge of town. At the feed market, she met an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, and when she asked about anyone hostile toward the Amish, his memory sparked. There had been one guy, he said, volatile, always complaining, hated the Amish with a passion, said they were hypocrites and frauds. He'd left an Amish community in another state and carried a chip on his shoulder the size of a redwood. Quila's heart pounded. This matched the profile perfectly. What did he do for a living? She asked. He was trying to start a brewery. Abernathy explained. A small operation in the industrial area near the foothills. Thought he'd make a fortune. Failed miserably. Went bankrupt a year or two later. A brewery, the smell of yeast. Proximity to the foothills. The timeline matched, and when Quila pressed for more details, Abernathy remembered something else. The man always smelled strongly of yeast, like he bathed in the stuff. Unpleasant. Every piece was falling into place, but Quila still needed a name. And to get that, she had to navigate something even more foreign and intimidating than the modern town. The county records office. The journey to the county seat was a trial. Quila had to hire a driver, endure the speed and noise of car travel, and then face the bureaucratic maze of the records office. The process was slow and frustrating, filled with unfamiliar forms and confusing terminology. But after hours of waiting, she finally got access to the archives. Sifting through dusty folders of business licenses from the mid-90s, she found it. A small brewery called Bitter Creek Brewing, located in the industrial area near the foothills. Filed in 1994, went bankrupt in 1996. And the owner's name was listed at the bottom of the application, Kenton Burr. The name resonated with chilling familiarity. Burr, the name Abernathy had suggested. Keela stared at it, her hand trembling. The abstract evil now had an identity. She returned to the feed market immediately and confirmed it with Abernathy. Yes, that was him. Kenton Burr. Nasty fellow. Hadn't been seen in years. Heard he'd moved north after the bankruptcy. Keela brought her findings to Detective Russo the next morning. She laid out everything, the name, the brewery, the timeline, the confirmation from Abernathy, the connection between the smell of yeast and the anti-Amish sentiment. Russo was impressed. This was the strongest lead they'd had in 9 years. He ran a background check on Kenton Burr. The results came back quickly. Burr was still living in California, about 3 hours north in a small town in the Sierra Nevada foothills. His record showed minor offenses, DUIs, disorderly conduct, a few assaults, nothing that screamed serial killer, but enough to paint a picture of a volatile, angry man with authority issues. But then Russo dug deeper. He traced Burr's movements back before he came to California, back to Pennsylvania, the heart of Amish country. And what he found made his blood run cold. In 1992, a young Amish girl named Sarah Stoltz, aged 16, had disappeared while walking home from school in the area where Burr had lived. No witnesses, no evidence, no resolution. And Kenton Burr had been questioned at the time. He'd recently left the Amish community under acrimonious circumstances and was known for his hostility toward them, but there was no evidence linking him to the disappearance, and he'd been dismissed as a suspect. They weren't dealing with an isolated incident. They were dealing with a serial offender, a man who had been hunting Amish women for over a decade, and the attack on Zilla Hostetler suggested he wasn't finished. Russo immediately initiated surveillance on Burr's residence in Northern California. They needed to know his routine, his movements, gather enough evidence for a search warrant. And what the surveillance revealed was deeply disturbing. Burr behaved erratically, pacing his apartment, peering through blinds, making frequent trips to his vehicle, a dark blue Ford Bronco that matched the description from Zilla's attack. He seemed paranoid, agitated, like he knew the walls were closing in. But the most suspicious behavior? Every day, Burr made lengthy visits to an isolated industrial area outside of town. Specifically to the site of his former brewery, Bitter Creek Brewing. The property looked abandoned, overgrown with weeds, the warehouse dilapidated and boarded up. Why would Burr keep returning to this place? He'd spend hours inside the warehouse, entering a specific section that should have been condemned. Russo felt a growing certainty. The warehouse was significant. Isolated, secure, directly linked to Burr's past. It was the perfect place to hide something, or someone. But here's where the legal system became an obstacle. Despite the compelling evidence, despite Burr's suspicious behavior, Russo didn't have enough for a search warrant. The connection was circumstantial. They needed direct evidence linking Burr to the crimes. And while they waited for that evidence, gathered more proof, built their case, Burr remained free. Keela was devastated by the delay. Every day that passed was another day the truth remained hidden, and deep in her heart, a desperate, agonizing possibility persisted. What if one of her daughters was still alive? What if they were being held in that warehouse, suffering while the police waited for permission to act? The thought was unbearable. And that's when Keela made a decision that would change everything. If the police couldn't act, she would. She hired a driver and made the journey north to the small town where Burr lived, telling her neighbors only that she was visiting distant relatives. It was a half-truth, a lie of omission, but it didn't matter. Finding the truth was all that mattered now. For days, Quila conducted her own surveillance. She watched Bear's apartment, observed his routine, confirmed his daily trips to the abandoned brewery. And then she decided to do something incredibly dangerous. She would confront him directly. She knew his routine. Every morning at 8 o'clock, Bear went to a local diner for breakfast. It was public, neutral ground. And that's where Quila went, arriving before sunrise, sitting in a booth near the entrance, waiting. When Bear walked in, Quila stood up and approached his table. She looked him in the eye and said, "His name, Kenton Bear." His reaction told her everything. Surprise, recognition, rage. "I want to know what happened to my daughters," Quila said, her voice steady. "I want to know about the abandoned mine shaft and the smell of yeast, the same smell on the day Zilla Hostetler was attacked, the same smell that clings to you now." Burr exploded. He flipped the table, dishes shattering on the floor. He lunged at her, his face contorted in fury. "I should kill you right now," he shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. The diner owner called the police, and Burr stormed out, but not before making his threats crystal clear. Quila had rattled him, exposed him, and now he knew she was hunting him. What happened next was a terrifying chase through the streets of the small town. Bear pursued Quila on foot, his rage blinding him to everything else. She ran through alleyways, through a crowded outdoor market, barely staying ahead of him. Finally, she managed to board a public bus just as it was pulling away, escaping by mere seconds. But the confrontation had served its purpose. Burr was distracted, panicked, focused entirely on finding Quila, which meant the brewery would be unguarded. This was her chance. Her only chance to get inside and find out what he was hiding. That evening, under cover of darkness, Quila made her way to the isolated industrial area. The abandoned brewery loomed ahead, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. She found a section where the ground had eroded, creating a gap underneath, and squeezed through. As she approached the warehouse, the smell hit her. Overwhelming. Yeast and fermentation mixed with something else. Something foul, the smell of decay. But there was a guard dog, a large, aggressive Rottweiler chained near the entrance. Quila had anticipated this. She'd bought raw meat and sedatives. She fed the drugged meat to the dog and waited, her heart pounding until it finally lay down and closed its eyes. She found a broken window, climbed through, and dropped into the darkness of the warehouse. The interior was a maze of old brewing equipment, towering vats, rusted pipes, and shadows. She moved through it carefully, heading toward the area where Burr spent his time. What she found was disturbing. A makeshift living space, filthy and chaotic. The walls were covered in twisted writings, a mixture of religious condemnation and misogynistic rants. This was where Burr nurtured his hatred. But there was something else. Hidden behind stacks of grain sacks, almost invisible in the gloom, was a heavy metal door. An old cold storage room, reinforced and secured with a large new padlock. Quila pressed her ear against the door. At first, silence. Then a faint sound, a slight shifting, a suppressed breath. Someone was inside. Her hands trembling, Quila found a bolt cutter in a nearby toolbox. She positioned it around the padlock and squeezed with all her strength. The metal groaned, resisted, then snapped. The lock fell to the ground with a clang that echoed through the warehouse. Quila pulled the door open. Cold air washed over her, thick with the smell of filth and despair. She fumbled for a light switch and flipped it on. The sight that greeted her was so horrific, so profoundly wrong, that she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The room was small, windowless, a concrete cell. The floor was covered in filth, the walls stained and peeling. And in the center of the room, huddled on the floor, was a woman. pale, thin, her skin almost translucent. She wore ragged clothing, her hair long and tangled. She was rocking back and forth, reciting something in a low, monotonous voice, the strange ritualistic phrases from the warehouse walls. And then the woman opened her eyes. They were blue, bright, piercing blue, the same blue as Elizabeth's, the same blue as Iva's. "Iva," Keela whispered. It was her younger daughter, 19 when she vanished, now 28. But when Iva looked at her, there was no recognition, only fear. "No," Iva whispered. "He will be angry. I'm not allowed to speak." 9 years of captivity had erased her identity, her memory, her connection to the world. Burr had broken her, indoctrinated her with his twisted beliefs. She was terrified of Quila, terrified of punishment. But Quila knelt down and started speaking to Iva in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language of their home. She hummed a lullaby, a simple tune from their childhood. And slowly, painfully, a flicker of recognition appeared in Iva's eyes. "Mama," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Yes, Iva, it's me. I found you." The dam broke. Iva sobbed, clinging to her mother, the years of suppressed pain pouring out. They held each other for a long time, the silence of the warehouse broken only by Iva's weeping. And then Iva asked the question Keela had dreaded. "Where is Elizabeth?" Keela's heart broke again. She saw the answer in her mother's eyes, and the truth came tumbling out. Eva recounted the abduction, the sudden attack on the isolated road. Elizabeth had fought back fiercely, trying to protect her younger sister, but Burr had been enraged by her defiance. He'd hit her too hard. Elizabeth had fallen, hitting her head on the edge of the buggy. She never woke up. Burr had panicked. He'd brought them both to the brewery, but Elizabeth was already dead. He'd disposed of her body somewhere Iva didn't know, and he'd kept Iva locked in the cold storage room for 9 years. The abuse, the isolation, the forced indoctrination. It was a horror beyond comprehension. "We have to go," Keela said urgently. "We have to get out of here before he comes back." But just as they reached the door, the warehouse flooded with light. Headlights, the roar of an engine. Burr had returned. They hid among the towering brewing vats, holding their breath as Burr entered the warehouse. And then came the roar of rage. He'd found the open cell door. He was searching for them, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, his voice a low, threatening rant. He found them. He lunged at them with a metal pipe, and a desperate struggle ensued. Keela fought with primal intensity, using the cluttered environment to her advantage. She kicked chemicals toward him, pulled down unstable equipment, created barriers. And then she saw the opportunity. A large, unstable fermentation vat towered over them. As Burr lunged again, Quila shoved the vat with all her strength. It tilted, groaned, then toppled over, crashing down on Burr with a deafening roar. He was trapped, pinned beneath the crushing weight. Keela grabbed Iva's hand. "Come on, we have to go. Now!" They fled the warehouse, running through the darkness toward the distant lights of town. They didn't stop until they reached a road where a passing truck driver saw them and called the police. Detective Russo arrived with a fleet of emergency vehicles. Burr was extracted from the wreckage and taken into custody, severely injured but alive to face justice. Eva was rushed to the hospital, suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and profound psychological trauma. Sunrise found them in a hospital room. Eva was asleep, the deep, restful sleep of the truly exhausted. Keela sat by her bedside, watching her daughter breathe. One daughter found, but the other lost forever. The investigation expanded rapidly. The search of the brewery yielded evidence linking Burr not just to the vault case, but to the disappearance of Sarah Stoltz in Pennsylvania. He was charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and long-term abuse. The case was airtight. A memorial service was held for Elizabeth in the community cemetery. The entire settlement attended, the silence heavy with shared grief. Bishop Yoda approached Keela afterward, his expression humbled. "We were wrong," he said. "We urged acceptance when action was needed. We failed you." The community embraced Keela, offering support and solidarity. The isolation she'd felt dissolved in the face of shared tragedy. They pledged to help her and Iva in the long journey of healing ahead. Months passed. Iva was transferred to a specialized trauma care facility. The healing process was slow, arduous. She was withdrawn, barely verbal, struggling to reconcile the twisted ideology forced upon her with the reality of the world. But Keela remained by her side, a constant presence, bridging the gap between the life Iva had lost and the future she now faced. The trial of Kenton Beer took place. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The verdict brought closure, confirmation that justice had been served. But it didn't erase the pain. One afternoon, Keela brought a quilting frame to the facility. She set it up and started quilting, the needle weaving through the fabric. Eva watched, curiosity in her eyes. She approached the frame, her hand reaching out to touch the fabric. "Do you remember?" Keela asked gently. "We used to quilt together." Eva nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Keela handed her a needle and thread. "Would you like to try?" Eva hesitated, then took the needle. She sat down beside her mother, focused on the fabric, and pushed the needle through, completing a single stitch. It was small, imperfect, but it was a beginning. Keela looked at her daughter, her heart filled with profound love and fragile hope. The road ahead was long, the healing incomplete. But they were together, and they were moving forward, one stitch at a time. So here's what I want to know from you. If you were in Keela's position, facing opposition from your own community, legal barriers from the authorities, and direct threats from a dangerous predator, would you have had the courage to keep searching, or would you have accepted the mystery and tried to move on? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the mysteries that refuse to stay buried. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.